Well, welcome to a new Team CGC 9.8 video, and today I kind of wanted to go over the basics of comic book collecting, and I've sort of separated it into three categories, I think, and there's collecting, investing, and speculating. So we'll definitely get into all those in more detail. Before that, I just want to remind you to join the team and subscribe to the channel here. Just at this early time, we definitely need all the subs that we can get, and I think right now we're at about 82 or 83. So if you're seeing this video early, you can subscribe now, be one of our first 100 subscribers. That would be so much appreciated. So getting into my comic book fundamentals video, sort of the basics, I guess you could say. Before we get into those three categories I talked about, my one overarching rule for investing and collecting comic books is to buy what you love. So, I mean, there's so much out there, so many heroes, especially with a lot of these new Netflix shows coming out. There's a lot of these new heroes and teams that I've never heard about. So in general, I kind of stay away from those because I want to buy what I love. I want to buy all those things I have that nostalgic connection to. So for me, that's mostly like 80s and 90s comics, I would say, and some new stuff that I'm really attracted to as well. But yeah, no matter what you're doing, collecting or investing, just buy what you love, and then you're gonna have fun. And life's too short to do things that make you feel cringy or you don't like it, or somebody told you to buy it, so now you buy it without even really liking it or knowing anything about it. So buy what you love, and you're gonna avoid a lot of the pitfalls of comic book collecting, I guess, if there are any. But so yeah, I want to talk about collecting and speculating first. And then we'll talk about investing more because that's more of what I'm most familiar with. So collecting to me is, the sign of a collector is someone that has a lot of long boxes, a lot of issues, and they just enjoy buying almost everything. It's going to be different for people's budget, but in general, a collector is going to have a lot of like non-key issues, a lot of somewhat unpopular series maybe. For me as an investor, you're sort of focusing on those key issues and the books that I think that will hold their value over time, and because they're a first appearance of something, maybe even increase in value over time. Whereas, if you're buying whole runs of things and you get maybe 3 or 4 key issues in there, and then, 40 or 50 issues where, they might be great to have on hand and you might feel great about that, which is good. But a lot of those you end up just going to selling to a comic store down the line for like 25 to 50 cents for like non-key issues. That's pretty much how much comic stores will buy those for. So in general, when you're collecting, you're sort of, for lack of a better word, wasting a lot of money on non-key issues and a lot of new books that probably aren't going to go anywhere in value. So that's the sort of a mark of a collector, I would say. Now a speculator, is sort of, an example of a speculator I would give is, you have to do a lot of work to do it successfully, and you have to be following the trends and the data. So, one thing, just as a sort of example, say you're watching a Netflix series and you think next season something's going to happen, then you find the comic for what you think is going to happen, and right now that comic is maybe you can buy it for cover price or $5. So you load up on that. When said incident on Netflix happens, 6 months down the line, then you can sell those books you bought for $5 for like $30 or $40. So that's like ideally a scenario that, a good scenario for a speculator. That would be something that a speculator would do, and that would be like something good that they could do. A lot of the times though, like, I wouldn't recommend speculating really at all, because the number one thing is a lot of times you're breaking the number one rule. You're buying things that you don't really like or you don't really care about because they're trendy in data, or because you think that might happen on Netflix or whatever, so you're going to buy the books. Personally, not my style, because usually if you just find about something's going to happen in some show, you just sort of found out about that. There's no nostalgic connection to it. There's usually no iconic characters. A lot of times it's a really obscure issue if it's still only selling for $3 to $5. And a lot of times that said thing that you thought was going to happen doesn't even happen at all. And then you end up basically wasting money on buying issues that nobody wants. That's how it could sort of go wrong. Another way I think it could go wrong is, since you are following the trends, I mean, every now and then it's really easy to get emotional with something that you might actually really like, but because it's hot, because the trends and the data are telling you it's hot, the market's inflated because there's more people in the market. Many of those people are noobs. They're not really aware of the price. They just want that certain issue because it's trendy and hot. So you can easily get into that when you're speculating and make bad buys of things that are elevated in price, because there's a lot of emotion involved when you're dealing with trendy things. So yeah, that would be collecting and speculating. And like a good analogy, I think, is a stock market analogy. And I think anybody can understand this analogy, even if you don't care about the stock market. But you can invest in, say, Coca-Cola, Costco, and Home Depot and Walmart. You can pretty much invest in those companies and not even look ever at the news, not even ever check the stock market quotes, and you'll do well over time, because all four of those businesses make tons of money every day in profits. So you could feel really comfortable about investing in those sort of iconic stocks or iconic brands that make a lot of money all the time. They're not going to spike up, they're not going to spike down, but you should do okay over time. So those I would sort of compare to being Spider-Man, Batman, Star Wars, Avengers, X-Men, Wolverine, Hulk. Those to me are like the iconic, Costco's and Walmart's and Coca-Cola's of the comic book world. So that's an investment example. So in the stock world, a speculating example would be, if you were buying stocks like Uber or Beyond Meat or Zoom, and those companies sort of have big promises of profits in the future, but there's no profits right now. So basically you're investing in something that doesn't make any money right now. So obviously there's more risk, and the spikes could go higher up or higher down. And that, I think, is a good analogy to like speculating in comic books. So my philosophy is pretty much 100% investing. So, I want to stick to those iconic brands. That's one of my main things. Iconic brands: Star Wars, Spider-Man, Batman, the Avengers, and all, each superhero in the Avengers. Wolverine and Hulk, I think, also passes as pretty much iconic at this point. So those are basically comic books that, if you are smart and you buy, good high-grade issues in those iconic brands, you almost can't go wrong over time. And what I mean by can't go wrong, you will pretty much break even, I would say, especially if you're holding for over 5 years. And hopefully on some issues you do get some price appreciation. But this is a good time, I think, to talk about another rule that I think about quite a bit is, don't invest in comic books to make money. Comic books as an investment, if you just want to purely make money, then the best investment is like the stock market or real estate. Because, if you think about a comic book, it just sits there. It doesn't do much. All you're doing is you're hoping somebody else comes along down the road that is willing to pay more for it. That's pretty much all the comic. It's like sort of like if you were investing in Picasso or Van Gogh or something like that. Whereas if you're investing to make money, and say you invested in a share of stock in whatever company, that company is hopefully making profits every day. So it's actually spinning off cash. And that is a real investment, whereas comic books, they don't spin off cash. They just sit there, and so in that sense, they're not really investments. So if you wanted to make money, if that was like your goal with getting into comic books, I would totally recommend to not invest in comic books to make money. Just certainly invest in the stock market first, and then if you can save some cash, and then buy comic books from an investment perspective. And then again, over time, on some of those issues, you'll probably make money. On most of those issues, they'll be flat, so you'll preserve capital. But it's not like a stock where some stocks are really awesome, And if you hold them for more than 5 or 10 years, you can make 2, 3, 4, 5 times your money. And with stocks, it's really easy to put like 10 or 20 or 30 or 40,000 into one company, whereas a comic book, these two comic books being about $1,000 each, I couldn't just go, oh, I really like the Batman, the Dark Knight Returns, and put like $50,000 worth. And I mean, technically, I guess I could buy $50,000 worth of Batman, the Dark Knight Returns, but I wouldn't really want to do that. So, yeah, don't invest in comic books for like the sole purpose of making money. There's so many better ways out there to make money, and then just comic books are a fun thing. You should buy comic books because you love them, basically. So more about investing. So we got iconic brands. Usually when you're investing, you just want the key issues and the origins and the iconic covers and anything that is very nostalgic, anything that sells really well, because that will probably continue over time and even get even more pronounced over time. It'll continue to sell well. More people will come out of the woodwork that loved it when they were kids and want to buy more. And the older, some of these 80s issues that I really like to buy for $300-400 ish area in the 9.8 white pages. The older that generation that grew up in the 90s gets, they're probably going to be willing to pay more for these books because they make more money. So the longer you hold, you're going to have more upside, basically, in price. But as an investor, you stick with the key issues. I don't personally buy runs. I have 2 long boxes of comics, and that's it. I have like a little bit of room in one of them, and I don't want to fill that up. I also have 2.5, almost 3 long boxes, or I guess short CGC boxes full of CGC comics, and that's it. So 3 CGC boxes, 2 long boxes, and I'm done. I don't want any more storage. I'm just sticking to key issues and those iconic issues. And again, I think that's one of the big differences between an investor and a collector. Is collectors generally have long box after long box after long box because they're just buying so much, and generally you end up wasting a lot of money doing that. Whereas if you're an investor, you're basically picking and choosing, being really patient and waiting for those good deals on first appearances, origins, classic covers, stuff like that. The last thing I would say about investing is you're looking for limited numbers. So, and I do want to break this up into 2 sections because, me investing in 80s, 90s comics mainly, I recommend when you're doing that to only invest in CGC 9.8 comics if you're buying graded comics from the 80s or 90s. Only CGC 9.8s. That I think is the way to invest if you're focused on 80s and 90s and modern comics. If your budget doesn't permit, good rough copies too is a good strategy. But I wouldn't buy, the 9s, the 9.2s, and 9.4s. There's just so many issues printed in the 80s and 90s that you want that limited number of 9.8s. Like, we'll kind of go through some of these, but for instance, the Star Wars #1, there's only 567 of them in the 9.8s. So you're getting a 1 of 567 item, and that's a good thing when you're an investor. You want to know that you have like a 1 in 500, or 1 in 600, or 1 in 200, or whatever it might be. Once you start buying 9.2s and 9.4s, at that point it's getting into 1 of thousands and thousands and thousands, and it's just not a limited number anymore, and it doesn't become investable basically at that point. So 80s, 90s issues, buy CGC 9.8s. 70s, 60s, 50s, obviously the CGC 9.8s pretty much don't exist for a lot of those issues, or there's like 1 or 2 or 3 of them in the world. So in those eras for investing, I would recommend stick with the first appearances and the origins, but just buy good rough copies that's in your price range. So, if you're sticking to the 70s, 60s and all that, first Black Panther, first Thanos, first Silver Surfer and Galactus, so many good first appearances and Fantastic Four. Even Batman back in the 70s, first Scarecrow, and there's, first Poison Ivy, first Batgirl, and that Detective Comics really good. But yeah, there's so many ways you can go in the 60s and 70s. and even earlier. And that's, to me, like, that's probably the best way to invest in comics, is buying those, like, from the 60s and 70s, all those iconic first appearances. Whereas, you know, with me, buying these 9.8s from the 80s and 90s, I'm doing that because that's what I love. I don't have any nostalgic connection to, like, 60s comics or 70s. Like, I was born in 1985, so, you know, I like Venom, Carnage, McFarlane Spider-Mans, you know, Batman the Dark Knight Returns, huge Star Wars fan. So just sticking to what I like, basically. And yeah, so that's, I would say, in the 80s and 90s is probably not even the best way to invest in comic books, personally. The best way, again, is 60s and 70s, so many iconic first appearances. That's probably the best way, is just to buy first appearances and origins from the 60s and 70s. You'll do really good. For me, I stick to the 80s and 90s, and I recommend in those eras to buy 9.8s only. Okay, so a bit of a roundup there of sort of investing versus collecting and speculating. I got two issues here, though, and we'll take a look at. Two issues that I think are really good investments. One's a 70s issue, this one being an 80s issue. So this is Batman The Dark Knight Returns #1. First appearance of Carrie Kelly, the girl Robin. And yeah, I mean, this is so iconic, this comic. This is one of the top 10 best graphic novels of all time. This was done by Frank Miller, Frank Miller doing the story. And yeah, he basically, with this issue, this is one of the issues that essentially brought in the modern age of comics. So if you look at the sort of classic definition of Bronze Age comics, it goes from 1970s to about 1986. And this book, being made in 1986, used a lot of, like, modern techniques with the art and the story. And, you know, I know Todd McFarlane said, you know, Frank Miller was one of his big, you know, idols growing up, especially this book, you know, using all those crazy modern techniques. So this book's become very iconic. I think it's a really investable book for the 80s, great investment. Just looking on the CGC census, 18.4% of all graded copies are 9.8s. So of all graded copies of Batman The Dark Knight Returns #1, 18.4% are 9.8s. That's a pretty good ratio. You know, in the 80s, anything under 20, I would say, is you're getting pretty rare, pretty hard to find in the 9.8s. With this one, there are 518 9.8s in the world, in the blue label. So again, what's really important with investing is to get that limited numbers item, and this is one of 518 of such an iconic book. So that's why I think this one's a really good investment. And yeah, this one was, yeah, you're looking at about $900 to $1,000 American for this book in the 9.8 white pages. Batman The Dark Knight Returns, I mean, it's pretty much the first appearance of, like, modern Batman. And again, so iconic because of all the new modern techniques used. Top 10 graphic novel of all time as well. Such an investable book, such an iconic book. And another book that I think is probably one of the best investments right now that you can grab is Star Wars #1. This one being the 30-cent variant. I know those 35-cent variants are out there and they're so expensive. Yeah, I think there's like 1,500 of them made ever, and I think there's like one 9.8, so clearly out of everyone's budget. But Star Wars 1, the 30-cent version, I think is an amazing investment. Such an iconic brand. Doesn't get more iconic than Star Wars. This is the first appearance in comics, and yeah, another kind of cool thing about it is, you know, a lot of people think the movie came out before the comics and then they made the comic, so it's like not really the first appearance. But actually the comic came out before the movie was released. So in a way, this is definitely a true first Star Wars appearance sort of in pop culture. But, you know, it's sort of known as the first Star Wars appearance in comics, though. Star Wars #1, I think a great investment right now. In the 9.8 white pages, there are only 567 in the world. So a 1 of 567 item. Again, limited quantities being important when you're investing in comics. So yeah, Star Wars #1 I would totally recommend as an investment. This one too, I purchased late last year, I think it was, and on a weekly auction it ended up being about $960 US. So in the CGC 9.8 white pages for Star Wars 1. So yeah, these two books I think probably some of my two best recommendations for CGC 9.8 investment grade books that aren't just like astronomically expensive. And I know, about $1,000 is a lot of money for sure, but when you look at some of these other Bronze Age books that are $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, it's not looking too bad. Okay, so I think that's going to do it for today's video. I got two recommendations and kind of went over some comic book investing basics. If you have any questions, definitely let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and join the team. And yeah, like I said, we're about 83 or 84 subscribers I think right now, so if you see this early and subscribe now, you could be in one of the first 100 subscribers. And we're only about a month in with the channel here, so just getting started. Every sub helps so much. But thanks for watching today, guys. Really appreciate it. Hope you learned something. Again, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you on the next video.